Well, great to see you all here. I hope you all used your Oyster cards so that at least Transport for London knows exactly how you got here and can plan future transport accordingly. We have 4 great speakers coming with very different angles on cities. So I'm confident we're going to have a very wide-ranging and interesting debate, lots of new ideas and insights. As always, a lot of this evening is about you and your thoughts and ideas. This is not the kind of event where you get 5 minutes at the end and have to pretend you're asking a question. We're absolutely up for you having opinions and arguments. And so with that in mind, we've asked the speakers to do ridiculously short introductions. And then I may abuse my chair's privilege and ask them a few questions myself. And then it will be out to you. We have roving microphones, so everyone will be able to hear you. I believe this evening, actually I should have checked this, I believe this evening is being recorded. Is that right? It is. It's also being filmed. So if you lied about coming here, if you pretended you're having a secret rendezvous with your lover, but actually you're here for data spent on cities, good choice. But also just like, you might want to...
But there is a solution.
Oh,
there you go. If you talk to me discreetly, we'll make sure that
we edit you out. Or just like, if you want to say something, write it down and pass it to the person next to you. And there's a solution. But we obviously we have to tell you we're doing it. It would look really bad if we sneakily filmed you. So I think that's how it's going to run. We have an hour and a half, and then wine afterwards for the real arguments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce. We all know that's where the real arguments happen. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then they'll have a ridiculously short time to speak. So we're going to start with Malcolm Smith, who is Global Master Planning and Urban Design Leader at Arup, which, is that as grand as it sounds?
Unnecessarily.
Yes, good. Excellent. So he sets the design strategy for a wide range of urban design projects, both in the United Kingdom and internationally. I'm just going to talk about a few of them now. They have transactional urbanism at their core, so I hope we'll find out what that is. So as well as just physically designing places, he looks at things like integrated systems, resource efficiency, cultural strategy, multivalent infrastructures, risk and resilience, circular economy, and restorative landscaping. So he only has 5 minutes to explain what all those things are. Exciting, but he will have pictures. Then we're going to hear from Sylvie Delacroix, who is a Turing Scholar here at the Alan Turing Centre and also Professor in Law and Ethics at Birmingham Law School. And her research obviously focuses on the intersection between law and ethics, with a particular interest in machine ethics, agency, and the role of habit within moral decisions. And I think this is your book, Habitual Ethics, Bloomsbury Publishing 2020. So it's a book from the future.
Absolutely.
That's the first time we've had an author with a book coming back from the future. That's pretty cool. Okay. Then we're going to hear from Christoph Lindner, who's Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment and Professor in Urban Studies at UCL, University College London, where he writes about cities, globalization, and issues of social and spatial inequality. So he's an urban and a cultural theorist. He looks across fields of architecture, visual culture, geography, media studies, and urban planning and design. And then finally, we're going to hear from Eva Blum-Dumontet, who's a researcher at Privacy International. This gives you a clue which direction she may be coming from, where she leads the work on the intersection between privacy and social and economic rights, and is particularly interested in researching the impact of data exploitation on marginalised communities and people in vulnerable situations. So previous work has included investigations into the intelligence services in Egypt, the use of social media intelligence as a tool for political repression in Thailand, and research on the impact of smart cities on civil rights. Before joining Privacy International, Eva was a journalist covering European affairs for the Franco-German state television network Arte. So, what a panel, eh? Very exciting. It's ridiculous, really, to expect you all to do such a short introduction, but I promise you, you will get time later to come back and we'll get a proper conversation going. So would you like to start us off, Malcolm?
Okay, I assume I'm in control here. Cities. So I guess where do I start when I think about those things? There's a delightful phrase that Patrick Geddes, planner, philosopher, talks about, where he says, a city is more than a place in space. It is this drama in time. And I think what that reminds me is that in any generation, the form of our cities are really the manifestation of those priorities. You know, sometimes it was defence, sometimes it was economics. You know, in an age where we live, where we have a new currency of digital information and transaction and translation, you know, I think that sets the platform. So I wonder, what is the priority that changes the form and influences the form of the city as we think about it in a digital context? There were three things that I wanted to share tonight that set that tone. First is about movement. Second is about the invisible parameters that we begin to understand. And the third is a notion of disconnection. So, movement systems, a beautiful plan of organised space, of democratised land, of Barcelona on my right. And in one way, that is a system that understands movement, that is analogue, that I move and I look and I see my periphery and I understand that relationship. But when that system becomes automated, when that system becomes an omnidirectional mechanical vehicle that allows a system to understand its adjacencies without looking over your shoulder, without understanding the immediate context, but the greater context, the geometry of the plan of the city fundamentally can change. All of a sudden it becomes a system of flow rather than a system of control and mediation at points. And so the image on my left is not the plan of a city, but the plan of a structure of a building that we did in Beijing, the Aquatic Centre, where geometry of structure is being used in one way here as an analogy to the flows of digital movement systems, vehicles that could move. Now, that can move into a whole nother dimension. What happens to the ground plane of a digital place when 30% of the movement happens on the roof? When we start to move in 3 dimensions and challenges that we're being asked to look at now. The second question that I thought would be interesting to examine is a digital environment that allows us to reveal the invisible parameters that we can't understand. You know, it's interesting, you somehow think, you know, well, we can measure air quality, we can measure acoustics, we can measure, you know, rates of crime, we can measure levels of light, etc., etc. In one way, Charles Booth did that very cleverly when he measured and understood the epidemiology of the cholera in the wells of East London. But in one way, the enablement of a kind of a digital ordering system, and I guess is where a degree of the artificial intelligence of those systems comes in. The ability to understand not only them in themselves, but also their interrelationships, creates a kind of an invisible world that is revealed. I would suggest that what that allows you to do is therefore take informed choice. Many times that's a real-time information flow that's coming at us. So we see an invisible dimension of the city in a new way. The third one I wanted to do was, you know, in the world of kind of hyper immersion of our digital, you know, environments and the choices that we make, is there a space and a desire to be increasingly disconnected? Now, why do I think this is coming about? I guess we are seeing the role of digital in automation of conditions, the way in which, you know, things that are just able to be automated and produced allows a different space of thinking, a space of creativity, a space of innovation. Some would suggest that space happens in a very subconscious condition of wandering and a subconscious of disconnection from this formal system. We're doing projects where we consciously build these kind of retreats and disconnection. But I guess I finish with one other thought. A 13-year-old boy, when we were working in East London, was asked to draw an image of a city. He didn't draw a digital world. He drew a very experiential space. Now, I think the digital world, we'll hear many, you know, views passed over tonight. But I think at the end of the day, it is a critical tool that will transact its correctness and its incorrectness, its deployment. But the outcome of the city is an experiential place that drawings like Finnebar's remind us of the way in which it comes together. Thanks.
Marvellous, thank you. And a lot of ideas packed into a very short introduction. Thank you, Malcolm. Excellent. So, Sylvie, what ideas would you like to bring us to introduce us to the idea
Okay,
of smart
so
cities?
I guess
You don't have slides, do you?
I don't have slides, no. So I come at this from the perspective of data, right? So when you look at smart cities, they're just one example among many others of our drive to optimize pretty much everything these days. Yeah. So if some people manage to optimize what they eat, whom they meet, through apps that are maybe on their phones, then it seems pretty reasonable to say, why don't we try to optimize natural resources consumption, traffic, deployment of police forces in cities, right? Now, in all those optimization endeavors, there's one key ingredient, and that's data. Okay. The problem, there's one important difference, of course, is that when you collect data in a city, you do that by building sensors everywhere, yeah? And those sensors allow you to collect incredibly granular data in real time, okay? In a similar way as I can collect very granular data in real time about my moods, my state of mind, potentially, through my watch. There is one important difference between the collection of data on my watch and the collection of data in a city. And that difference is that when I use my watch, I can at least give some semblance of consent to the collection of data. Okay. When we're in a city and we move around the city that's full of sensors, well, I challenge you to give consent to that. Yeah? And so it's very difficult once you move to a smart city environment. The concept of consent becomes more or less useless. Effectively, you have to make do without consent. So what do you do then? Do you stop collecting data altogether? Well, some people might argue that that's what we should do, but I think, well, that's both unlikely and perhaps not so constructive. And so what I and a colleague of mine, Neil Lawrence, who's now in Cambridge, we've tried to put forward this idea that perhaps it's time for us to think beyond individual protection when it comes to data governance, and that smart cities are actually an example that illustrates the need to move towards groups empowerment, not just protecting individuals, but also constructing structures that allow groups of people to choose one approach of data governance that reflects their aspirations and their attitudes to risk. Now, how do you do that? Well, we propose to rely on trust law. Okay, trust law is a very ancient legal framework, and it has many advantages. But one of the key advantages is that it comes with very strong safeguards. When you create a trust, you appoint a data trustee, in our case, for a data trust, and that data trustee has a fiduciary responsibility to exercise your rights, your data rights, on your behalf, but with undivided loyalty. Yeah? So they have to exercise those rights with absolute faithfulness to the way you want these rights to be used. Okay? And this will be stated in the terms of each trust. Now, the beauty of this, at least the big idea behind this, is that we say, well, in an environment like a smart city, it's quite important to realize that there will be different aspirations. Some people may want maximizing security, say, maximizing the security of their data. Others may say, look, I really want to favor or facilitate medical research and better use of natural resources. Yeah? And as long as some safeguards are in place, I'm quite happy for my data to be shared with several actors. But unfortunately, me, Sylvie, I don't have time and I don't have the resources to engage in extensive negotiations with, say, natural resources providers, etc. And so I trust my data trustee to exercise my data rights on my behalf. And when I say I actually mean we, because the strength that comes with a data trust is the fact that you are there in numbers. And once you have numbers, potentially large numbers of people, you also have power. Yeah? Data becomes powerful when it's aggregated. And so the larger a data trust becomes, the more leverage it has when it comes to negotiating terms and conditions and data access, etc. And so that's what I want to probably emphasize the most here today, is that it's important when we talk about data trust, it's become a term that has been poisoned by an experiment that's currently taking place in Toronto in the Sidewalk Labs experiment. Okay? It's very unfortunate that in these circumstances, the Sidewalk Labs proposal seeks to evade suspicions related to the systematic collection of data by saying, it's okay, we're going to create, now they call it urban data trust. Now, don't ask me what it is. One thing I know for sure, it's not actually a structure that relies on trust law. Hence, it has none of the safeguards that come with trust law. And it's actually just a way for Sidewalk Labs, in this case, to bypass Canadian laws that make it compulsory that in order to collect data, you need to have consent if you are a commercial entity. So what do? They put together this kind of legal structure that is supposedly not a commercial entity that supposedly makes it legal to collect data without consent.
Could I just ask, who is familiar with Toronto and Sidewalk Labs and this project? So some people, not everybody. Do you think you could, in a few sentences, just describe the project? And
okay. I mean, I'm not going to claim to be the
Very
expert on the Sidewalk Labs experiment, but it's basically quite a beautiful, I've been there not that long ago. It's a very attractive looking piece of land. It's not that large.
Sorry, Sidewalk is a company within the same company as Google. It's part of the Alphabet, which is the Google family of companies. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
So, of course, as you can imagine, a company like Google, and here Sidewalk Labs is a subsidiary, the biggest game in town is to collect as much data as possible, on as large a scale as possible. Now, the prospect of being able to collect in real time data about a particular space, where supposedly just because you have built a smart infrastructure, you then, in Sidewalk Labs experiment, they think that it's okay, in that case, to say, we're going to collect data. We realize we can't ask for your consent, but don't worry, there is a legal structure called, in this case, the Urban Data Trust, that will negotiate licenses for use of your data, for this use and that use, etc. And so it will be taken care of, and it will not be handled by Google, in this case, or Sidewalk Labs. It will be an independent body. The problem is that they do not specify exactly what that body is, under what law it operates, and what the safeguards are. Okay, and that is a problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sylvie. So, Christoph, are you longing to get to this world where every aspect of every city is datafied and automated?
No. So my approach to this evening is to play a bit the role of technophobe. And I want to begin by confessing that I'm kind of hypocritical here. Probably like a lot of you, I am fully immersed in a digital lifestyle. My telephone is the first thing I touch in the morning. It's the last thing I see at night. I love Netflix to decide for me what I'm going to watch. Amazon tells me what I like and what I don't like. It orders things for me. It shows up on the doorstep magically. I feel like most of my life has already surrendered to the algorithm. And yet, in my professional life, I have to spend a lot of time thinking about the emerging world of smart cities and the emerging role of AI in our urban environments. So there's a lot I'd like to talk about in 5 minutes, and to try and squeeze a bunch of thoughts in, I'm just going to make a series of somewhat disconnected statements, and then hopefully some of this will resonate with some of you. So first of all, I think it's fair to say we live in the era of acceleration, right? In a world of hypermobility and hyperconnectivity. And within that world, I think we're also living through a new era of techno-fetishism. So what I mean by that is the projection of all kinds of powers and qualities onto technology. And we're asking technology, or hoping that technology, is going to be able to solve things on our behalf, make our world fairer, make our cities better, improve our quality of life, make politics more open and democratic, and so on. So a lot of us have placed a lot of faith in technology, particularly digital technologies, to do important, powerful work in our cities. And the reason I'm coming at this from a slightly technophobic position is that I'm deeply worried. The question in the description for this evening's event is, are we headed for an Orwellian future? And I was thinking about that, and I actually was thinking, what if we're in that future right now? If we look at the state of world politics, if we look at what's happening with climate change, if we look at what's happening with pollution, if we look at what's happening with the widening of the gaps between the rich and poor all around the world, I think we're in that dystopian future right now. And the idea that technology, that the optimization of systems, that more efficiency, that more data, that more ability to kind of crunch the numbers and compute our future is going to solve those things, I really don't buy it right now. It's nothing against technology, but rather it's about the systems of power and meaning that control that technology. So do we have faith in municipalities to make smart cities just for all people in a city? Do we have faith in, or confidence is maybe a better word, in the technology companies to use data to empower, to spread and share knowledge rather than to exploit and mine and so on? And finally, in the series of disjointed statements, I think my biggest issue here is rhetorical. The rise of smart cities. That word smart was such a clever word to use because it links the idea of the digital turn, of technology, of AI and all of that, and big data and everything else. It links that to the idea of intelligence, of improvement, of progress. And I don't buy it. And I would actually like to propose an alternative to the smart city, which wouldn't work all the time in all places, but it's kind of a rhetorical, philosophical alternative. How about a dumb city? You know, what's wrong with being in a dumb city? A city that's a bit clunky, that's a bit inefficient, where things are a little rough, where it's not all smooth and seamless and flowing. And the reason I would advocate a little bit for a dumb city is because I think that's where a lot of important human interaction occurs. If we surrender fully to a seamless algorithmic future, what happens to human interaction and what happens to the messiness of that interaction, where I think a lot of the important meaning of life is actually occurring?
Thank you very much. I must admit that the thing I never like about smart cities as a term is that it seems to imply that the city is smarter than we are, and we're kind of dumb, and we need the city itself to guide us through our lives, rather than us making decisions. So I like that characterization. So I imagine, Eva, that you're going to pick up rather well from this with some specific concerns about what the data gathering smart city could do.
Yes, but actually I want to go back to what you were saying at the start, where you were mentioning, talking about the perspective where I come from. So actually I should say, so Privacy International is a charity that works specifically on defending a world where technology can actually empower people and enable them, as opposed to purely being about the exploitation of data for power and profit. And so I don't want to play the role of the technophobe tonight. I want to play the role of someone who will try and challenge how we use technology currently. But first of all, the point I wanted to make about cities is that reminding us that there are places where democracy happens. And so we could go back to ancient Greece to be reminded of that, but actually we don't need that. We can just think back to the past couple of weeks, to actually this weekend, to realize that cities is where democracy is happening. It's where democracy happens when it doesn't happen in the polls. And it gets messy. And so historically, there's always been an effort from governments to try and address this messiness. So this is a street in Paris, actually near where I grew up, Rue du Vieux-Colombier. And it essentially gives you an idea of what pretty much every street in Paris looks like. This is why basically every building in Paris looks the same, because At the end of the 19th century, there's this architect called Osman who essentially destroyed the whole city and rebuilt it from scratch. And the idea behind rebuilding the city was that it needed a city that was healthier, that was going to be cleaner as well. But the other side of the narrative, and you see it on really on the picture of what the street has become, is that we needed to have streets that would be wide enough that people wouldn't be able to build barricades, because what they were desperately afraid of was that there would be another revolution. And to be fair, it took another century until 1968 when Parisians figured out how to build barricades that were wide enough for the streets and to topple the governments. And so, obviously, what does it look like in the era we live in today, the era of data exploitation? Well, a good example of that is Rio de Janeiro, where when they were preparing the Olympics and the World Cup, they invested a lot of money on building monitoring centers to predict crimes, to predict natural catastrophe, essentially to police the city. They were working with IBM on this. I think it's worth also remembering we're talking about the term smart city. IBM is the one that coined this term. They were the first one to come up with the term. And I should say they've done a lot in shaping what our understanding of smart city. And this is why it's interesting that actually their flat project is this, well, very Orwellian kind of model. But we see a very similar model, for example, in Singapore. But as I said, I do not want to be the dystopian one tonight. And because I also don't think that it serves a good description of what smart cities are like, and especially what they're like in Europe. In fact, we're talking about Orwell. I think it's more a Brave New World kind of situation, in the sense that actually smart cities at the moment are very much motivated by very good intentions. And so we just need to look at the programs in London. Not sure why so many of those were still at draft level back in 2018. But essentially, if we look at like what's motivating smart cities, we see things like transport, environment, health inequalities. And what are those issues? Well, they are very complicated problems. They are very complicated human problems. They deal with how people live in the city, how they move around cities, how they interact with each other. It's very complicated. And here comes companies like IBM, like Google, like Cisco, that tells local governments, hey, you're suffering from austerity, you have restricted budgets, we have this perfect tech solution to make your city better, more efficient. And that's what has been really driving the narrative. So I only had 5 minutes, so I just wanted to leave you with those questions to think about. And really, essentially, what those questions are about is about asking what maybe a dumb city or at least a good city would look like. And I think it's actually about putting citizens back at the center of cities. And where at the moment we have a narrative that's very much driven by private companies and what they can offer to governments, what would a smart city that's actually smart for people, that's taking into account people who have disability, who are in vulnerable situations, what does a smart city would look like for them?
Marvellous, thank you very much. One theme that seems to have emerged from all of you in different ways, and I'd be interested to come back and just maybe gather one more thought from each of you before I come out and let the audience have their say, which is this idea of efficiency and optimization, that if we don't like smart city, maybe a digital city or a high-tech city enables one to do, is that there are systems which can enable us to do the same things more efficiently or even optimize the way we live for some parameter or other, so that we can do things better using the technology. So maybe a couple of questions in relation to that. One is, is there a problem with the very aspiration to be more efficient? Is there anything, I mean, it's one of those words that seems like, how could you possibly object? Who could possibly want a less efficient? Oh, well, there you go, good. So maybe there is a problem with that idea altogether, even though instinctively you think, well, surely efficiency is good. And the other question, of course, which relates to this idea about democracy and the citizen, which keeps coming up, is who decides what you're optimizing for, what are the parameters, what is it we want to do more efficiently. So, but perhaps would you like to come in first and object to efficiency altogether?
Well, it's not to object to efficiency. We were talking before we started, we were planning a little bit what order to go in and kind of sharing some initial thoughts. And we were talking a little bit about smart fridges. And I quite naively was asking, so what exactly does a smart fridge do? And I learned that one of the things it can do is it can keep track of what you eat, and then it can order replacement stuff for you before you run out. It can even monitor what you're eating and what kind of calories you might want to intake or not intake. It could even connect to your smartwatch, keep track of your health and your movements around the city, and try to balance that with your food intake and so on. One might argue that represents a certain optimization of eating food in domestic life. But for me, one of the issues I would have is that it overly interconnects all kinds of things, and it would remove, in the space of the home, some really important things, like interactions between people, food as a source of surprise, and that wonderful experience of going home and saying, I have nothing in my fridge, what can I make tonight? I don't know, let's get creative, and voila, a new dish was born, things like that. But in a way, it also relates to something else that's come up, which has to do with kind of privacy and just how deeply we are comfortable letting data gathering intrude in our personal lives. So, do we next go to smart mattresses and smart beds, smart, what couldn't be rendered smart? But in doing so, are we, in a way, intervening overly in human agency? And it's not that there's a right or wrong thing. I think it's a spectrum. It's about balance. It's about what we're comfortable with. But in the process, I think we are redefining the whole notion of privacy and human agency, and sometimes we're doing it without really thinking about it. And I think maybe that would be my point, is let's make sure that when we make these transitions, we do so in a conscious, knowing way where we have consent and things like that.
Malcolm, could I get you to defend the benefits of efficiency?
Well, Christoph is very good at arguing for the, for the kind of dilemma of the over digitization of our domestic life, and it's a very, but I wouldn't want to, I almost kind of want to take it to the other extreme. It was interesting. I was, you watch, the famous Inconvenient Truth, and you watch Al Gore go up the escalator, and he sees the climate, the graph going up. And we were talking the other day, and someone showed me the graph of that is roughly our carbon consumption going up. And then they showed the graph of carbon reduction that is required, and it is not a mirror. It is about 5 times steeper. So if you're going up like that, it needs to drop like that. So I agree with kind of the issues of domestic, the demon of data in a domestic life. But I do wonder whether the ability to see our systems that we have built that are causing the planetary impacts, that data plays a role in that, with all of the issues of maybe this is our saviour of the planetary scale of impact that we have produced over that kind of escalating stage. So the efficiency with which we can begin to understand the impacts, to test the alternatives, to mitigate the impacts, I hope data gives you the option to have that beautiful meal in 50 years' time, or your family's family. Because at the moment, we cannot kid ourselves. We have a tipping point at a planetary level that I think data and the digitized understanding of our world has a significant role to play in efficiently allowing us to mitigate that and adapt.
So there, Sylvie, do we all have to just donate our privacy for the greater good?
I think the key here is to understand that actually optimization. So I think we've always been fascinated by the idea that we can run our lives more efficiently. I think that's something that is kind of a fantasy that's been inhabiting humankind for a very long time. But now we have all this data at our disposal, and it makes us very excited. And there are some people who think they can't possibly, for instance, marry someone without being sure that they've met the appropriate person by using an algorithm that tells them, yes, you are dating the right person, right? How crazy it is to think that your partner for life might be chosen randomly in a pub. That's shocking, right? So the idea here, if you are like me and you have a bit of a romantic fiber and you think, actually, I quite like the idea of meeting randomly the person I spend my life with, well, that is the romantic bit, and it might sound funny. But to get you to, I think to understand what's at stake here, it's really helpful to see this contradiction. So I want to see who in the room, let's imagine you are very old and you struggle to get out of bed and to eat, things like that, right? And we are, say, 50 years from now, there are really good robots that can help you get out of bed, get dressed, prepare your meals, help you feed, etc. Now, who would like to have a robot rather than a human to help them do these things? Raise your hand if you would.
A few.
Okay.
Oh, it's coming now. Now you've seen other people doing it. It's a little bit more.
Yeah. Now I'm going to ask you. So let's imagine there's a robot who is guaranteed to systematically raise the scores of your children in key state exams, yeah, A-levels, GCSEs, etc. Now, would you entrust your children to such a robot? Raise your hand if you would. It's guaranteed better scores, yeah? So say 20% optimization of scores. Yeah, so who would entrust their children to such a robot? Yeah, we still have some people, but a lot less, right? And so here the interesting question is, why? So what's the asymmetry in those two scenarios? Because on the face of it, they're both cases of optimization. Yeah? On one hand, we want to optimize the way we live when we're old and we need help. And then on the other hand, we'd like our children to do well in our exams. And so if we have guaranteed performance, why not use robots? And I think the key insight here is to think that perhaps we value imperfection, that part of growing up, part of becoming better humans or to be a human, in fact, is to be imperfect and to come to celebrate imperfection, to understand imperfection. So when we educate children, I think what we do is not just to get them to pass a math exam, etc. It's to also get them to understand that we each have flaws. And how do we navigate life, given that we each have those flaws? And it's not just us who have flaws, it's also cities who have flaws. And so I think there is room for optimization in important areas, like, for instance, better use of natural resources. Yes, big time, yeah, and it's time we wake up to that. But just because it's possible to optimize things doesn't mean we should do it everywhere. And I think I'm a fan of not using dating apps, and I'm also a fan of not using robots to teach children. Yeah.
Marvelous. Lit.
Yeah.
Okay, a lot of fans. I like that you're keeping the French romantic image alive. Some stereotypes are worth clinging to. So Ava, you were talking about it's how you use the technology. Can you see a way in which we can use technology, we can optimize, but somehow retain that democratic control, that democratic input, or are the two always going to be in tension?
Well, I think that it's going to tie up with a few points that were made before, is that I think a lot of it comes down to the question of choice and the question of consent as well. Because I want to be able to use dating apps, but I also want to be able to travel in take the train without being tracked. At the moment, TfL doesn't really give me that option. Other underground system in other cities of Europe would. And I think that's some of one of the key questions is how do you give agency to people? How do you allow people that actually want to use technology, want rely on this, without punishing the ones that want to opt out? And how do we build this in a city is, I think, one of the keys to this.
You reminded me, actually, another thought that I had, although maybe I'm going to just get you to hold this and throw it out, see if other people have thoughts, which is about the disconnection and talking about people having consent and different groups in society in existing inequalities being revisited, amplified through technology, I just started to wonder whether the ability to disconnect will become a luxury, that the automatic giving up of our data for harvesting will become the default, but the luxury option will be to disconnect, either to go into your ivory tower of non-connectivity, or just to not be tracked on the underground, that you buy a luxury ticket. But I don't want to keep you waiting any longer, because I can see you all watching and listening, great intent. So I'm relying on you to now have thoughts and throw them into the mix. So let's go out, and I'm going to take probably about 3 points from the floor before I let the panel come back in, so that you get about as much time as the panel from now on in. So if you'd like to say something, stick your hand up. I think we have roving microphones. Is that right? So stick your hand. Okay, so we've got one down here on the second row. Anyone else? Stick your hands up, because we've got 2 mics, I think, so we can double it. Okay, so there's one here in the aisle as well. So do we have 2 microphones or just one? Yeah. Yes. Oh, we've got one at the back. Okay. So yeah, if you'd like to get this, good. Okay, so come to you first, and then I'll come to the back. Yeah, go on.
Hi, Nathaniel Shin, studying smart cities at UCL currently at the moment on a master's course. I agree with many points that everyone has said so far, and I was just wondering to get your interpretation of, is the dystopian view that we think of smart cities a product of post-colonial urban planning that has been influenced by big data companies?
Marvellous. That was a big question. It's off. Excellent. Okay, so we'll come to you next, and then there was somebody about halfway down. So if we can get that microphone round to there, to exactly halfway up the aisle while you're speaking. Go for it, at the back.
Yeah, hi. I work with one of the private tech companies which are demonized.
So you seem to be breaking up a little bit. I don't know if it's generally with those.
Is this better?
That's better.
Perfect.
You need to hold them kind of like an ice cream that you're eating. There's a rough roll of that.
Hi. So I work for one of the private tech companies which are easily demonized in most of these discussions. And I work, in fact, in the data sort of part of that firm. I'm curious about a few things. The first one is, why is it the case that private companies become easy targets in that debate when we highlight the risk of them misusing the data, when we have a sufficient evidence of government entities doing the same thing, even though they are democratically elected, first of all? To quote examples like even the Cambridge Analytica, I mean, you had representatives of the people that were part of that problem. To quote another example from India, the Aadhaar issue, wherein the government wanted to sort of use that system, which was a risk perceived by the court and the people. So in that space, can we sort of have an equal spotlight on all players that are involved in data collection? Or is there a risk in focusing on just the private sector and sort of forget that there is another player there that might do something fishy? That's one. And second, as a middle way out, do you think is a public-private partnership in the building of smart cities a good way out, such that both those sectors keep a check on each other and sort of move forward?
Excellent. Normally I'd object to 2 points, but they are obviously clearly linked, because you've kind of posed a problem and a possible solution. So the Aadhaar is the Indian government biometric ID system, isn't it? Yeah. No, it's a very good question. I think we do tend to point to private companies and say, you're collecting our data, whereas governments are collecting at least that and then buying what they haven't collected themselves. So very, very good point. Like, are we pointing our ire in the wrong direction? So I think someone, yes, do you have the microphone there? Or you don't know? Okay, coming down. Good.
Let's assume that we've got a nice clean set of data to start with, and one of these brilliant algorithms, and some of them are really brilliant. Isn't one of the problems with a smart city or smart anything, what do we mean by smart? In particular, if we optimize the city for one set of people, are we making it very much worse for another group of people? I could take a quick example. If you look outside at St. Pancras Square, where they have the facial recognition cameras, I reckon if I put on my gardening clothes, put a sleeping bag over my shoulder, I might be removed from the premises fairly quickly because it's a private space in the city. But it would keep the place safe and clean under some people's definitions. So I think one of the problems is that we as humans have to somehow specify very accurately the algorithm and what we want the algorithm to do when it's crunching all this data. Yeah. And I think that's an almost impossible problem.
Very good points, and be very interested to hear what any contributions people have. I'll take one more before I come back to the panel, if there is one. Anybody? See, now there's two. Okay, I saw your hand just about first, and then I'll come back to you afterwards. Don't be shy now, and then don't put your hands up in the last 5 minutes, all right? Okay, I'm going to take this gentleman, come back to the panel, then I'll come out again. Go for it.
So we heard in terms of governance and data, we heard about the trust law structure. In terms of, are there other paradigms we can use in terms of governance? And what stage of implementation is that in the UK and other countries? Because I feel like the pace of technology is like moving like a cheetah, and the regulation is like moving like a pregnant cow. So how do we match the two?
Very good point, and what a wonderfully vivid analogy. Yeah, regulation is going to be eaten alive, clearly. Okay, so 4 really good points there. So is this an offshoot of post-colonial level planning? Why do private companies get all the stick when, in fact, governments and local authorities are just as liable to collect data and use it for their own purposes? And what about public-private partnerships? Is that a solution, or is that part of the problem? Can we avoid or somehow deal with the issue that if you optimize one group of people, you may be disadvantaging other groups of people? Is that someone phoning the answer in? And finally, are regulations and trusts going to be eaten alive by the cheetah of technological advance? So, I encourage you, between you, to try and cover all those points, but meanwhile, just tackle the one that you'd like to first. Who'd like to start off? Would you like to, Ava?
Yeah, I'll start with the first point on the post-colonial offshoot. I would say it's very much a neo-colonialist project in a sense of like. So if you look at the two countries where there is the most sort of like active development of smart cities, we're actually looking at China and India. But actually what I find really interesting is the development of a smart city project across different countries in Africa, across Latin America as well. And again, they're a bit of my obsession, but the role of IBM in developing this project, because they had this project called the Smart City Challenge, where they were essentially offering cities free advice, free consultation, and free IBM products. And essentially, I mean, this is pretty much an easy way of summarizing it. Those continents became testing grounds for the Smart City projects that they were eventually selling in the north. And I think what's interesting also about this is how you obviously have companies based in the north imposing their vision of what a smart city is. And to go back to your point about what does smart mean, well then we put in the hands of those companies in the north with their own interest to define what smart is, to define that actually having a privately owned public space is a smart way of dealing, with homelessness, with people looking funny, with the environment. And so to that extent, yeah, I think the colonialist element is actually a very strong one in understanding how smart cities are actually happening in the rest of the world.
Great. What about you guys? What would you like to pick up on?
I was going to talk about the post-colonial city, because in one way, we've done some work in Shwani in Africa, and you see the kind of the change of the nature of that government system. And then you kind of go to a pre-colonial environment in there. and a fundamentally different cultural construct, the way in which the people before the colonialization structured their relationship with environment. You know, instead of the carving up of the land, it was the collective entity of gathering and operating in a fundamentally different structure. But a city by nature is a place of kind of, it's always interesting to think about it as a place where you have to give up a little bit of self in order to act as a whole. You know, if you want to just be yourself, you kind of run off to the middle of a forest or something and you live in isolation. And so I'm always interested looking into the Northern European cities where the way in which they plan, there is much more of a giving up of a degree of self for the collective whole. And I don't know whether there is an analogy into the way in which data is then used. There is all the kind of the safety mechanisms. You know, in the world in which we live in here, of which I've lived in for 26 years, we are much more egocentric. We are much more kind of, you know, isolated and determined. And I think that is the fundamental problem. I don't know whether a kind of post-colonial world of my previous, you know, country that I lived in Australia draws those examples. I could hear you talking about, you know, the impacts of IBM testing in Africa. Well, you know, the UK tested nuclear weapons outside where I lived in Australia. You know, and so someone deploys data, my first point, you know, people used to deploy weapons. Today they deploy data. You know, it's the ability to I think, raise it and elevate the discussion to the way in which it is being deployed, to test it and therefore invent the mechanisms to hold it accountable that is as important as worrying about, you know, is it right or wrong?
So I have to say I'm finding my fellow panelists to be incredibly compelling and incisive. And this doesn't link everything that's come up, but I think something we haven't talked about explicitly, but it's been part of all the questions, and I think it's been part of what we've all been talking about, the word power. That data is a new form or source of power in our world. And related to that, the way it's deployed, and this goes to your question, sir, about what we mean by smart city. I actually think we live in a new era of power, a new kind of power, but also that power is exercised in a new way. And here I think another word that's important is violence. Now, conventionally, traditionally, we would think of violence as a coercive exercise of power. But I think what's happening with data, and in particular, if we bring AI into the mix, is that we now have a seductive exercise of power. And the blurring of the boundaries between the public and the private that we're seeing all over the place. But in cities, we're experiencing it spatially in the conventional notion of public space. What is a public space? And I think more and more what we have are quasi-public spaces. They have the appearance of publicness, but the reality of kind of securitization and privatization. And so all this stuff is being blurred, it's becoming increasingly indistinct. But what's at stake in the middle of it all is who is able to exert power and over whom is that power being exerted.
So to kind of link that back to the gentleman at the back about private companies collecting data versus governments, local and national, collecting data, in a sense, that blurring of public and private space is not only happening in the world of data, but also in the physical world and the spaces which appear public, but in fact are privately owned and policed. Can we tackle the issue of public-private control of data without seeing that in the context of, if you like, real space, but also the space of power and the exercise of power?
I think here I would probably turn to our colleagues who have more expertise than I do.
Well, so it's interesting because actually we're all speaking really a tune that goes well together to some extent. So when I was going to jump in when you were mentioning power, and today there's no doubt that data governance choices will shape our future. These are the choices that will have probably the most significant effect on our future, whether it's about natural resources management or something else. And at the moment, the vast majority of those choices are made for us. Yeah? It's very difficult for us, individuals or groups of individuals, to have a say, to contribute to those data governance choices. And here, I think that there's an image that really helps understand what's at stake. In the 19th century, there were things called the land societies. And this was a time when, in order to get the right to vote, you had to be owning the freehold of a piece of land. Right? That was the condition. Now, what did people do in order to maximize their chance to get the right to vote? Well, they pooled their resources together, in this case money, and they bought a piece of land, which they cut into small parcels. And that meant that instead of one person having the right to vote, you had many people having the right to vote. And I think if you think in this way about data trust, it really helps to understand what's at stake. In the same way, this is a mechanism that allows people to pool resources, in this case data, to acquire a voice. And a voice, in this case, is not to vote, but it's a voice that gives you the power to have input into how your data is used, for what purposes, and what priorities should be given to use of data. So this is one aspect that ties in with this aspect, the power question. At the moment, it's essential. We do have top-down regulations like the GDPR that protects, that give us rights. Yeah. Now, most of these rights are actually very difficult to exercise. Yeah. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that you have a right to portability, access, erasure in some circumstances. But good luck exercising them. I mean, the people who do actually find they have a lot of obstacles on their way. And we found that most access requests, for instance, are met with answers that are inadequate. The majority of answers are actually illegal in the sense that they don't answer the query. And it's only if you ask again that you are more likely to get the answer you should be getting, right? And it's quite, when it comes to the exercise of the rights we are granted by top-down regulation, we are still, well, you could call it the Middle Ages of data governance. And what we're lacking are bottom-up empowerment structures. Effectively, ways of overcoming what is essentially a medieval data governance structure, where there are serfs, you could say the serfs are the big data collectors. The lords are the big data collectors, and we are the serfs in that we label, in this case we leak data on a daily basis, and this allows the serfs to maintain their power and augment their resources, etc. And so the data trust idea, to answer your question about the cow and the cheetah, was that?
Yeah.
So true, yeah, regulation is super slow. Now data trust, the beauty of this is that you don't actually need, well, I have got to qualify this in a bit, but it does not in principle need legislative intervention. All you need is to rely on a piece of law that's already existing, that was created for actually crusaders who came back from their crusades and who found they couldn't get the title to their land. Now, today, we can rely on trust law. There is it's a technical problem that might need regulatory intervention, and that technical problem is that the rights to portability, access, and erasure that you need, that are essential in order to be able to switch from one trust to another. Yeah? So say I join Trust A, which maximizes financial returns. And I say, no, I've changed my mind. I want to maximize better use of natural resources. So I want to switch. How do I switch? Well, I exercise my rights to portability, access, and erasure. Yeah? So in order for this switch to be possible, these rights need to be able to be transferred from, in this case, a data trustee to another. But most fundamentally, my rights need to be mandated to a data trustee, right? And this mandatability, it's a technical term, but there's no replacement for it, at the moment is not quite, based on the GDPR, it won't work. So you might, in fact, it's likely we need a national legislative intervention to make that possible. But that's it. And it is happening, I'm glad to say. So the UK AI Council has created a data working group only 3 weeks ago. It's hot news. And that data working group, guess what it's going to do? It's going to work on data trust. So it is happening in this country. In Canada, actually, the concept of data trust has been put in their digital charter. So Canada could be deemed to be the most advanced country when it comes to data trust. Well, mostly because they have such a big problem on their shore. But yes, it is happening. And I think it need not move at a pregnant cow rate.
So we've put our pregnant cow on roller skates at least. Okay, so I'm going to come back out and take another maybe 4 questions. If we keep everything really speedy, we might get another round after that. So I did see a gentleman over here just before the break. So we'll start, if you want to stick your hand up again, we'll start with you. And then somebody here. Oh, it's 2 people here. I don't think, can you get round to these 2? But we'll start with you, yeah.
So coming from a crime and policing perspective,
Seems that
Yeah.
it seems like there's like a lack of any kind of real coherent thinking on how we're using AI and machine learning in policing, and I'm just wondering what kind of needs to be done. What do you guys think needs to be done to clarify this and rectify this lack of kind of as I say, clarity in thinking, and from a legal and regulatory point of view, and maybe even from a practical point of view in who needs to be involved in that conversation. Do the software companies themselves, should they have an important role in that, or should it be kind of policymaker driven, or as was said earlier, driven from the bottom up, or what needs to happen to ensure that AI is used responsibly in policing going forward?
Very good question, because you're right, there's lots of piecemeal things happening, facial recognition, although in some other regulatory areas that's being banned. We've got police forces here taking data off mobile phones of not only suspects but also victims, which I think Privacy International did a very good report on, and of course predictive algorithms. So lots to talk about there. So I think does somebody have a microphone here? Excellent. Off you go.
So I think the panelists have touched on a number of times the need for bottom-up empowerment and engagement from citizens on these kind of issues and how we use data and technology on cities. And I see this as very challenging based on how technical these issues are. And so I'm wondering what suggestions or solutions we can have to make these debates and these conversations more accessible to people who don't have the backgrounds or the education that I'm sure many of us in this room have benefited from.
Very good point. How can we all be properly involved in the democratic discussion when some of them are really, really hard to understand actually what we're dealing with? Very good point. I think let's pass that to the guy behind you. And then did anybody else? Okay, yeah, so there's a hand up there. If you could take that one up there while this person speaks.
Hi. My question is really simple. It's just basically what is AI? What would you define as artificial intelligence? I'm going to come back to what I can't remember your name. Sorry, or what you said about
Sylvie.
Sylvie, yeah. What you said, like, would you want a robot to teach your children and have them get perfect grades in everything? Personally, I disagree. Nearly all of us disagree. Didn't put our hands up, but I'd say that there's information, there's intelligence, and there's wisdom. And I think wisdom comes from good judgment, and I think and this comes back to artificial intelligence, which I think is like when you hear the words or read the words artificial intelligence. Like it automatically screams out like this supreme being, like an all-knowing, powerful, godlike being that can just wipe us all away. But if you read about what artificial intelligence, what I've read, like a few pages in the book, it's not a sentient being. It's not sentience or conscious. It's an algorithm that's being created by a team of people. So, like this sort of, I'm trying to humanize what artificial intelligence actually is or what it could mean. So I just want to know, what would you define it as?
I think you've just demonstrated that. It's a very far from simple question. It's a really hard question, but a really important one. Thank you. And somebody at the back has the microphone, yeah?
Yeah, so my comment is about kind of the complexity in expressing human preference with relation to the data trust. If an individual has a preference for how their data is utilized, and that is an ever-evolving and also fallible viewpoint, they might think they want one thing and don't actually want that. How would a data trust look to kind of encode and facilitate those preferences in that way?
Okay, very good and very specific question. Would you like to take that one first,
Okay.
and then we'll come back to the maybe some of the wider questions?
So on that question, there's a simple answer. So first, data trusts can have very different ways, different governance structures, if you want. So some data trusts might be run more like cooperatives, with very deliberative structures that demand input from the members of a data trust for key decisions. So you can run a trust like that. You can have also trusts that are run really hands-off. People say, you know what, I want to have nothing to do with choices that have to do with my data. Please handle this for me. Now, you're quite right to say that on one hand, most of us are very uncertain about what priorities we have when it comes to our data governance choices. And so these will not be easy choices. And at the moment, I think what matters is that there be at least a variety of trust. My nightmare scenario is a scenario where you have one, possibly two trusts, which then accumulate huge amounts of power and put this power in the hands of few individuals. And then that would negate the whole point of data trust. So the reason I'm insisting on choice is that you want to create more of a culture of precisely of debate and hence raise awareness of the fact that actually, A, we leak data on a daily basis. Most people don't realize that. And B, there are choices to be made then about how your data is used. At the moment, we're still in the, I'll use that word again, middle ages of data awareness. And I think it will help to have, in the beginning, it won't be easy, and it's quite likely that many people won't make a choice because they won't be bothered or they won't be aware of the risks. And so you're going to have to consider difficult questions like, what do you do then? Do you assign people to a default trust in the absence of choice, but then with all the risks that entails? But just like we provide default pension funds for people who don't make a choice. So these will be difficult questions. I'm not claiming that this is an easy peasy route ahead, but I think this answers your question anyway about the murkiness of our priorities, etc. You're right. And some trusts will be structured so as to allow continuous debate, others less so. What matters is that at the end of the day, you can switch.
Okay, good. And this kind of leads us slightly back to that broader question of, we all, I think, all of us on the stage want a wider range of people to be able to be actively involved and have some say and have a real democratic oversight to what happens. But how is that possible when a lot of these questions are very technical and quite difficult to understand and kind of demand a degree of understanding of what the technology is and what it's capable of? So
I think that's a really good point, because I have no idea exactly what data I'm generating on an everyday basis. There's probably tons. But even if I got it all back, I probably wouldn't recognize it. I wouldn't know what I could do with it or understand what it means. So I think that's a big part of the discussion here, is that a lot of what we're talking about for most of us is actually quite inscrutable, which makes it then really difficult to empower. But it also makes me wonder, what if we approach this from a very different direction? And instead of resisting and trying to reclaim back some control and agency, I kind of wonder, what would society look like if we all collectively, completely jumped in with both feet and just fully released all data whenever it was wanted in every context and every place? Why are we clinging, and I don't actually mean this, but why are we clinging to a quite dated notion that our movements, our activity, our life in the world somehow belongs to us? So we have this really conventional notion that privacy is something we have, that our data belongs to us, and if someone can see it or access it, they're taking a part of us with them, and we should have some control back. And I wonder, to go to your point about AI, maybe the problem here is that actually we are clinging to outmoded notions of the human. I know this is not going to be a very popular view. And so, artificial intelligence, maybe the key thing is to remove the word artificial, like smart cities. It's a rhetorical flourish. To put the word artificial in front of intelligence signals something that it will always be kind of problematic, uncomfortable, and maybe we need to just embrace intelligence as intelligence.
So Ava, are you all wasting your time? I mean, maybe privacy is just a last century notion and we should all just get with the program, hand our data over, live in an optimized, efficient world?
No, and I think someone was talking about Aadhaar, the ID program in India, and I think this is an important reminder. Our data is our identity. This is when we talk about our data in the abstract, is that we forget that it's us. It's just saying, well, I've been here at this location at this particular time. It's our biometric data. It's our bodies. It's who we are. And this idea of handing it all. Are we handing it all our fingerprints? Are we handing our locations? Who we're speaking to when? And so that's what I think we need to also reconnect with what data means. And by data, it's who we are. It's our identity. Just to answer, I think it was a really important question about artificial intelligence and policing. I think there is a real huge problem at the moment with the question of transparency. And I think before we can even get to really challenging how police forces are relying on artificial intelligence, we need to understand what they are actually doing. We've done hundreds of FRA requests that we're challenging in court against literally every police station in the UK. And we cannot get any answers as to what they're using, how. It's been absolutely horrifying, the lack of transparency we've been confronted with. And even, obviously, I mean, policing was one thing and is one very important thing, especially in the context of using artificial intelligence for predictive policing. And just, well, before we get to actual definitions of AI, predictive policing is about using existing data that have been collected about people in certain areas to try and predict where crime is most likely to happen, or in some cases to try and predict which individuals are more likely to commit a crime before they've even committed it. So we're really talking about things that are really challenging or perception of the justice system, of how we are, thinking about our institutions as well. And so the fact that there is so little transparency is extremely worrying. But at a different level, I'm working on London councils and the question of benefits. And so I'm doing research at the moment on how they're using data including from companies like Experian to try and identify the so-called benefits cheats and people who are cheating around housing benefits. And essentially, there was a program that was written about, which is called the London Counterfeit Hub. It was written about in the media when it was launched, and then no one heard about it afterwards. And I contacted a lot of London councils. They all pointed me to e-link councils, even though they were using it as well. But they were saying, oh, if you need any information, you need to ask e-link councils because they were the ones who handle the contracts. So even though, for example, Islington Council, Croydon, and Camden were also using it, they were unable to answer any of my questions. As far as e-link was concerned, they said, well, we actually stopped using it. But again, this is the things that don't get reported. Why did they start using it? Why did they stop using it? This is the things that we are evolving in a world where all data is being collected about us, they are being used about us to try and assess if we deserve to be on benefits or not. And we don't understand this. There's no transparency around this. And that's the first real problem we need to address.
Malcolm, can I get you, I mean, feel free to chip in on any of those. Is there any chance you can give us your thoughts on what AI is?
Well, I was thinking about it in two ways. One, I feel like I'm sitting here as kind of the slightly kind of digital optimist, a little bit, but maybe I'm just digitally naive. you know, I was thinking about, in the world that I exist, where we are designing cities, where we are making them, and being able to use effectively a digital process to optioneer a thing that we were doing, where we took 30 to 40%. We were testing billions of permutations of the way in which a system could be, reduced and optimized in its structure and its construction and all of that. We take 30 to 40% of the resources out of a project. That if we were just to do it, well, we couldn't do it because it would take too long. So, but even after that process of using the incredible processing of a digital environment to artificially inform ourselves what the permutations are, and that's the way I classify artificial intelligence. It takes you somewhere that you could not have, we could not have got to. There still remains that human aspect of judgment and assessment and contextualization and all the nuances of the political context, cultural context in which we sit. So I think it's that. But I'm also aware of, while hearing the incredibly articulate, argument of the risk and transparency of the role of data, there are systems of the way in which, I see, medical pathways being understood in a completely different way, to understand permutations and relationships in a much quicker way that should produce a much, safer, fundamental outcome in a critical medical context, with all the risks that go with our medical data and all of that. And so we are in a very transactional space of, whether it's optimizing the resources that we use, the speed at which we can define a medical condition, with the outcome of how that then artificially, spreads itself into a wider context.
I know you want to come back in, but we've only got a few minutes left. So are you able to hold that thought? I just want to see if there's one or two. See, I knew it. You always do. You sit there at the beginning like, oh, no, I don't want to say anything. No, I don't want to say anything. And now you've all got your hands up. Okay, you've got 1 point each. No trying to spread points out, okay? So up down there, and the yes, okay, yeah, hand there, and then the one next to you. I'm going to try and get you all in, but keep it really speedy, and then I'll let the panel answer everything and sum up. Okay, so I'll start with you and then come up to you. No, not you, you at the front, and then you.
Malcolm, you mentioned medical data.
Yeah.
And the thing about medical data is that there are great gains, and nobody would deny that, but there are also great risks to people, depending on what's in their medical records. It can affect their care, can affect their ability to get insurance, get employment, all sorts of things. And we've had the government actually trying to harness data in ways with Google DeepMind at the Royal Free with care.data, and they've done it so ham-fistedly and wrong that that there's a backlash.
Yeah.
And there is a possibility that people will start saying, I'm just not going to give my data. I don't even care if it prejudices my care. I'm not going to give it. So we have to be careful that to maximize the benefits, we have to make sure that we are not losing people's trust, because once lost, it doesn't come back.
Yep.
Very well put, thank you. So we'll go to you, and then keep your hands up, and we'll get the microphone around as fast as possible.
Hi, thank you. So it was kind of mentioned earlier that there's like a couple of options as to like the management of data. This idea of like open data and give everything away, or maybe keep it all to yourself. I don't necessarily agree with that, because I want to use my cool apps that are customized to my data preferences. But similarly, I want to be able to choose where and how that's used, and I don't necessarily want to share my location data, for example, all the time. And then similarly, I don't necessarily want to choose a trust. I like the concept, but it may be quite complex. So I think that it needs to be a lot more focused and more like user-centric. There are a lot of technologies coming around now, like Inrupt and DigiMe, that are fully centered on the user owning their data and controlling their data, and that enables things like GDPR, like compliance. But the problem there, I think, is that, similar to the question that was raised, is that it relies on there being education, and that is a massive, massive, massive issue, because this place should be full, and it's not. And I think that the responsibility then lies with the big companies, not only the data guzzlers, but also the barons, but also the infrastructure companies like Arup, for example. You put in these systems, these big infrastructural projects, you have a responsibility to give the user the control of their data, because we do want to see optimization, we do want a better quality of life, and I think it does rely on the big companies funding it.
Thank you very much. If I could encourage you to keep your points that pithy but a little bit shorter, that would be great. So, okay, I'm not going to come back to you at the back because you've had a say, but this guy here in the suit, yeah, and then, oh, you've already got one. Okay, so lady with the yellow microphone first, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
Oh, right. Well, I think I represent probably one of the oldest people here. Most of the people in this room are the age of my grandchildren. And unlike them, I wasn't born with a smartphone in my hand. But I'm clinging on with my fingernails to not feel I've landed in cloud cuckoo land. I think it's amazing what can be done with data. But how are you going to keep great swathes of the population for whom all this would be absolutely a foreign language altogether? How are you going to keep them on board? How are you going to educate us so that we do know how to protect ourselves? What is available? God forbid, what did he call them? Smart fridges, who would order the food I didn't like that I'd eaten yesterday. But, you know, seriously, I'm clinging on here with my fingernails, very interested, but there's not many of us here because they wouldn't have a clue and would be completely disenfranchised in the way that they wouldn't be able to get involved in any of this. So what are we going to do? Do we need to get government on board? You know.
Very good point. Yeah, there's a lot of people for whom this is not second nature, and how are we all going to be able to protect ourselves and inform ourselves? Okay, guy with the red microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm a data protection officer, university in the south of England. Yeah, thanks for all the four panelists and chair, of course, for your great contributions. My question is really, have the panel unnecessarily simplified some topics, particularly in terms of, there's been a lot of talk around my data. It can't always be very simply distilled into my data. For example, very quickly, take a promotion board report where people are giving their opinions on a candidate, and you can identify the personal data of the people giving those opinions as well as the person they're giving the opinion about. So it's not always, maybe with apps, you can identify very easily one person's own personal data, but under GDPR, it's not always easy. For example, with subject access requests, I deal with in terms of what is just that person's personal data. Could be others as well. So there needs to be a balance sometimes and follow the law and guidance as well from the Information Commissioner's Office as well as GDPR. Thank you.
Very good point. And the idea of data ownership, which is again one of those things that sounds intuitively, well, this is the answer, is actually a bit more complicated than that. And so maybe that's something to pick up on. Last chance, anybody else? Yeah, okay, hand down here, and then panel. I will give you, apparently we're allowed to overrun slightly, so I'll give you 3 minutes each to answer everything. So you have the last word from the audience, no pressure.
Is there a role for blockchain technology to be used to democratize the data collection and use such that the power is taken away from governments and the big tech companies who currently own all the data?
Excellent. You win this evening's blockchain prize. Sorry. No, there's a serious point. I'm sorry. I feel mean now because it's a serious technology which potentially does have that capacity to be both unalterable and encrypted and therefore private. So yeah, it has potential. I would be interested to hear if any of you can suggest how that might be used. So you have about 3 minutes each. I think maybe I'll take you in the reverse order that you started with. So we've got the idea of, well, medical benefits, immense risks, but medical data, immense risks, immense benefits. But if you lose trust, then you're really putting that in jeopardy. Are we looking at user-centric models, data ownership, although that was then queried by the other gentleman? How to make sure that older people who didn't grow up using this stuff are equipped to both protect themselves but also take part in these debates. And blockchain. So so let's go in the reverse order that we started with. So Ava, if you'd like to sum up everything about the whole evening in about 3 minutes, that would be ideal. Off you go.
I'll start with the blockchain. Yeah, no, I think we need to remember what a blockchain actually is, and the fact that it's essentially a register where any data you enter that you can't erase and change, and what that means when you enter anything to do with like personal data, with identity, it's enormously risky. And I think a lot of people throw in the word like blockchain without necessarily understanding the consequences and the implications of it. And to be fair, the math around blockchain is absolutely fascinating. And I think in terms of like contracts and so on, I think it will certainly have really interesting implications. But anything that has to do with personal data, I think we should treat extremely carefully when it comes to blockchain. Now, I think that there was like a broader concerns in the room about people's involvement and about obviously what happens when people just don't understand or don't feel like they can get involved, and what that means for the data. And I think as much as in my presentation I was talking about citizen participation, and I do believe in people having a voice in how their cities are being shaped, I also think the law should be protecting people who don't want to get involved, because we don't have to have this room filled. We don't have to have everyone being fascinated and obsessed about the intricacies of GDPR or smart cities. It's okay to not care. And the point is that we should have a legal framework that also protects people that don't care. And I think GDPR is a really interesting legal framework for that. I think it's a really ambitious one. And when we're talking about the cow chasing the cheetah, I think actually, GDPR is the cheetah. And the ones that are the pregnant cows is actually the companies that need to catch up on the implementations. And they need to live up to the legal framework that we have, which is ambitious. And so yeah, if that answers the question, I think we need regulations that protect people who don't care, because one of my main concern, and I'll end on this, was the way TfL ran their program on essentially tracking people using their Wi-Fi service, is that if you didn't want to be tracked, you needed to do all sorts of, you needed to put your phone on airplane mode. And actually, even if you did this, they would still be able to track you, and that didn't bother telling you this. But anyhow, the point is that it was an opt-out model, when really it should have been an opt-in model. If you wanted to be tracked by TfL, you should have made a deliberate step to tell them, yeah, it's okay, you can track me, and not the way they did it, which obviously was failing people who don't need to get involved or to necessarily understand the intricacies of this.
Okay, very good. That covered almost everything. Christoph.
So I think the questions have been really very challenging. I mean, my mind hurts trying to think through all the different issues that have come up tonight. And what I like about that is it's clear data is not a stable thing. We have many understandings of what data is, how it works, how we might want it to work. And I apologize for repeatedly, except for one moment, playing the technophobe, because I think the final comment I want to make is just to reflect for a moment on just how exhausting it is, and how much of my day, and I imagine a lot of your day, is taken up just with managing the data. All the beeps and bleeps and things that come in and go out, and verifying your identity, and then proving that who you are, and then getting access, and then trying to get out of something. And I feel like most of my time, most of every day, is spent just interacting with different kinds of data. And it's a struggle often, and it's tiring, partly because it's overwhelming. It's in every aspect of my life. And in fact, sitting here tonight, this hour and a half is the longest I've gone without looking at my phone in a very long time. And I desperately want to check and see what's on there. But what it says to me is that our relationship to data, yes, it's political, it's philosophical, it's technical, it's all these kinds of things, but it's also deeply psychological. And I think that's a part of data that I think we would benefit from understanding even more. So going to the question of preferences that came up earlier, you know, I would like to use this, opt into this, opt out of that. All of that makes sense, but increasingly I have to ask, where are my data preferences coming from? And when I think they're coming from me, are they really coming from me? And in the age of surveillance capitalism, I think it's fair to say that more and more our desires are not our own. And that kind of worries me. I'll stop there.
Well, on that rather worrying philosophical note, Sylvie, I mean, you were saving up some thought from earlier.
Well, that's great because it's perfect connection, actually. So, you know, there was a moment where we floated the possibility that maybe we only care about privacy because we stick to an outdated concept of the human, right? That it's a very 19th century to care about privacy and that maybe we should just go for total transparency. And this connected me to a comment someone made to me, which really made me think. They said, but what if privacy is just a habit? What if the reason we care about privacy is just that it's just one of those habits we have? Like we, you know, I have a habit of getting dressed in a particular way. Also, I care about privacy. And that was challenging. It made me think. Why? Because if it's a habit, then perhaps sometimes it's time to get rid of a habit because there's no justification for it anymore, right? So that made me think. And actually, when you said at some point, you said, yes, but of course we should care about privacy because privacy is who we are, right? Or data is who we are. And actually, I want to step in on that because it's not. So I think the reason we care about privacy and our personal data is not so much that it's who we are. It's that we are all works in progress, each and every one of us. We're not finished products. Yeah, no matter how old we might be, we are works in progress. And so there's the possibility that we might always be in the process of becoming someone else. And the problem is that by leaking data that then gets processed to create a profile, and the profile is what determines what we see online, what we see, the adverts we see, the offers we are given, etc. This then seems to imply that we have no choice anymore. We have no choice but to become the person whom our profile anticipates us to be.
I don't mean to interrupt, but that is such a brilliant point, and you are so right, because the other night I watched a program because Netflix told me to. Said I would want to like it, and I was too tired to resist.
Did you like it?
Well, it tells me I want to watch it. I'm sure I'll like it, and so I watched it, and I didn't even know if I liked it, but I felt like I ought to like it.
Exactly.
So I think you're completely right.
Yeah, you've now become the kind of person that likes that program.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is deeply scary, and that is probably why we care about privacy. It's not a habit, I think. And it comes to your point, I could see you were saying, but I care, yes?
The other lady was saying that you don't care. Well, we don't care.
Yeah.
We're desperate.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, but I'm saying I'm acknowledging that we are a minority here and that there are a lot of people out there who don't, and they should be protected as well. Like the people, not only the people who care should be protected.
So what I just want to finish on that, is that if you care, then actually what we need, just like in the 19th century, a new profession was created, was the medical profession because of advances in medical science. I think today we also need a new profession, and that's the profession of data trustees. And that answers to the same kind of vulnerability that medical professionals answer to. Yeah, when we go and see a doctor who tells us you have cancer, suddenly the awful thing is that you might become the person who has cancer, apart from all the other troubles you might have. And it's the same with data. The awful thing is if we have no choice but to become the person who is anticipated by our profile. And that kind of vulnerability, I think, needs to be answered, and we need data trustees as a new profession.
So Malcolm, you follow that, sum up the entire event, and then we're going to take this beautiful, lively, complicated, human, squishy conversation about, which started with cities and has ended up with how we become the person we're becoming without being clamped on by the data.
But-
So
but-
if you'd like
but
to
the
just
city-
sum all that up and then fire us into the
But
bar.
the city is civic, it's civitas, it's this, it's dialogue, it's transaction, it's negotiation. That is the city. I can talk about the physical city, but this is the city. And so I will hold my optimistic view. And I'll say it in a different way of thinking about it. You know, I read a book called Architecture and the Crisis of Modern Science. And in that, the author talks about the moment there's that Newtonian split, when Newton takes, before that, meaning and logic is meshed. The cathedral is as much the geometry of stone and structure as it is the place of God. And at the Newtonian moment, it separates. Logic moves over to this side, and meaning and spirit and culture move over to that side. And I think we headed off with that logic and meaning. The data is the inevitable conclusion of that. I feel we are converging again. I feel that the city and the transaction and the civic discussion of what is right, who is responsible, who has transaction, is now pushing against the engine of logic and process of data. And so we are at a very special point in time. And I think we will see, as I can imagine when Newton was trying to explain his new understanding of science that needed a new language, that we are in the process of inventing that new language, of inventing the new laws, and the process of the city is the platform at which both that technical logic and that meaning of place come together.
And on that note, please thank the panel and yourself for tremendous.